One of the, biggest hurdles we face in play therapy is the parent that does not have the understanding of the value
Mhm.
of using the toy as the vehicle with which the child can communicate and express what is going on inside of them. Play is your child's language. And so when they pick up the toy, whether it be a dollhouse, a puppet, they are expressing to us in the way that they know how to express the complexities that are going on inside of them. Hello, pod people. Welcome to this week's episode of
Why Do People Do That?
I am Stacey Pelletieri.
And I'm Heather.
Barton,
Yes, sorry.
just in case you don't know. And we are licensed clinical social workers, and we're here to talk about why people do that. So we have today with us Jonathan Alexandratos.
Nailed it.
I nailed it.
Nailed
I was
it.
worried I wasn't going to say that right.
No, you're an honorary Greek at this point.
Yeah, yay.
Yay.
So I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you are definitely the master of who you are, and I am not. So tell us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, my name is Jonathan Alexandratos, and I am many things, but professor, writer, toy collector. Most recently, I was the toy expert in the Emmy-nominated $1 Billion Babies, the true story of the Cabbage Patch Kids. So that was a lot of fun.
Wow.
I have one book out from McFarland called Articulating the Action Figure, which is the first edited collection of academic essays on action figures, which is right here. And I have a monograph that's coming out, that's all me, about fast food toys from McFarland as well. That's in pre-order right now. That's called Free Toy with Every Meal. And it really is the first sort of tome to look at the not just history, but cultural impact of fast food toys. So Happy Meal toys and stuff like that. I write for Toy Collector, the magazine, Toy Wizards, the Toy Blog. I'll be at Toy Fair in a few weeks. Basically anything that starts with toy, you could probably find me at. And I also write plays about toys. So there's that.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's a little rundown.
I definitely want to make sure that at some point before we end today, we get to your new book about the fast food toys, because I have a definite personal story that connects to that I'd like to kind of just throw at you and see what you think.
I'm excited.
Do we want to just start there?
We could.
I'm game.
Good.
Let's go. I'm psyched.
Is it going to take us off track?
Is it going to take us off track? Is
No.
that where you want? You're the expert.
Let's
Where do you want
go.
to start?
I want to go where you want to go. To be honest, just real quick, licensed clinical social workers saved my life in college. No joke, because I was in a really dark place myself when I started college, and I went to our school's licensed clinical social worker for therapy and literally saved my life. So that's all to say, take the lead, because you always have, and you've never led certainly me astray.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry to hear you were going through a hard time,
Well,
but I
made it
am
out.
happy to hear that you
Got
honored
help.
yourself enough
Yep.
to get help, and you shared that with our pod people.
Sure.
because
It's
That's
important.
one of the things we always try to bring home, I think, in every episode, is how important it is to get help when you need it.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
It's absolutely life-changing and life-saving sometimes as well.
Absolutely. And I wear that on my sleeve, because I tell my students that, like, I make sure they are aware that our college has a counseling office. And I will take students there if they want to, and make sure they're not alone, and that they understand that this is coming from a personal place for me. So.
It's such an important resource. And having that, the permission, like coming from a teacher, like, hey, I'll bring you over there. It's okay. I did it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It kind of makes it okay and not so, taboo and stigma.
Yeah, it should never be a stigma. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I'm really grateful that these days it's much less of a stigma than it was years ago.
Yeah.
We definitely still have work to do in that arena, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing, because
course.
that's what helps people that are listening or watching.
Absolutely.
So if we're going to start with fast food toys.
Yeah, let's go.
So
let's go to the drive-through.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. So the drive-through.
Yeah.
I was there a lot. My son was one of those kids that needed to have the Happy Meal toy.
Yeah.
He was very aware, because it always connected to the popular movie that was out. And so like the popular movie would come out, the kids movie, we would have to go see it because he would know it was there. And then it was immediately, can we go to McDonald's? I want to get a toy. I need to see what toy. And God forbid we would get the toy we already got last time we were here. I would have to be like, I'm sorry,
Can
we
I
already
switch
have
this?
this one. Like he would have to see what the toy was before we drove away. And I would have to say, do you have such and such yet? And if they did, great. And we would ask for it. And if they didn't, it was like, oh, I guess I'm going to be back here in a couple of days. And I would have to keep going back and feeding my kids crappy food because we had to get that toy.
Right.
And I'll tell you something. He really, really, I think, respected and loved those toys so much. We had, you know, like those big bins that fit under your bed, like those big, you know, giant, long.
I'm very familiar with these bins, yes.
So I ended up buying a bin, like the biggest one you could buy that slides under the bed. And the entire bin was the fast food toys.
I believe it. I believe it.
We kept them all.
Yeah.
We kept them all until a point. At some point, we got rid of them.
Yeah.
Which is so sad. I almost wish we still had them.
What was the point where you got rid of them?
Why we got rid of them?
Yeah. Was it just age or just
I mean,
thinking about them in a while?
Yeah, it got to a point where, you know, we redid his room. He wasn't into toys anymore. I think we moved. And it was like, okay, do we really need to bring the Happy Meal toys that we don't play with anymore? And I think, you know, a lot of it was my husband that was just like, less is more, less is more. Let's get rid of all the crap. We're moving into a new house. We don't need clutter. We had a big garage sale.
Oh, I'm sorry I missed it.
And somebody... I feel sad about it now, thinking about it. Somebody bought the entire bin. I don't know how much they sold it for. It's probably like $5. Somebody bought that entire bin of Happy Meal toys.
That's great. Lucky person. Lucky person.
Yeah.
But think for a second about how novel that is. You're saying that we have gotten to a place culturally where you could have a big bin of one relatively new toys. I mean, okay, 10 years old, maybe. And you could sell them for $5 because they're junk, essentially, at that point. That is a relatively new historical phenomenon. If we were around in the 19th century and you got a new toy, that toy probably cost a good chunk of your family's available spending budget. You would not throw that away.
And that became kind of an heirloom. I mean, you would have like one doll and that would be it. And that doll, you know, would go to your sister and then eventually you have kids and it, you know, gets passed down because there was one item. Now we're in a universe of like just excess. So it's having so many of them and
Yeah. And that's right. And we know exactly those 19th century attitudes because scholars have written about how in novels at the time, toy destruction was viewed as a real problem. Like that would be like taking your laptop and smashing it or something like that because they were so costly. Today, toy destruction, especially if it's these Happy Meal toys, not such a big deal. You can kind of do it for fun, or you can give them away, or you can sell them for very little money. You know, that's a new thing. And I think people don't necessarily stop to understand that this is very recent, you know, this sort of disposability that we're working with today, for better or worse, you know?
Right. Yeah, so what are your thoughts about just where the Happy Meal toys fit in culture? And what do you think was going on for my son there?
Well,
as the expert.
So I have sort of a guiding light that generally tells me that whenever something is really small and ignored, it probably means a lot, actually, when you stop to consider it. So the Happy Meal toy, the kids' meal toy more broadly, is one of those things that's so small, we so rarely think about it. We'll go and we'll get them for our kids or for ourselves, and maybe it'll be very meaningful to them, but that's maybe where the processing stops. However, I think that we culturally as humans have had a very long history of getting important stuff with our food. So if you think about back in early Greek times, the basilopeda, the bread that came with a coin at the beginning of the year, and the coin meant good luck if you happened to get it. Just recently, I had a king cake. What was inside my king cake? A little plastic baby that told me I'm going to have good luck for the rest of the year. These little things that come with food culturally have taken on such a valuable meaning. Now, I'm not suggesting that Happy Meals are like that because, there's a certain spiritual meaning, religious meaning to these other examples that isn't true for Happy Meal. But I think that the action of surprise, you're sitting down for lunch and you're sitting down for a meal that's there to basically sustain your life. And with that, you are greeted by this unexpected, or maybe partly expected because you've seen the commercials or something like that, object that it comes out of nowhere. And if you're a kid, it really comes out of nowhere. Like I had that experience where I didn't even know how did this get in the bag? Like as a small child, I didn't know, it really became a magical thing. And as we grow, we start to wonder, I started to wonder, well, why is that? Why did that encourage me to want to go back the same way in the case of your son, you said? Your son, to collect more and more and more. What was that drive? And you know what? Today, honestly, I see the same thing. The discourse now around Happy Meal toys and kids' meal toys is that, they're not as good as they used to be. That's what a lot of people say. But I think that you actually see the same pattern in those blind box toys, that people go to like Target or whatever.
Oh,
and
Shopkins.
They get those. Yeah. Shopkins. That's a great example. And they'll get those. You don't know what you're getting. You open them up, and the pleasure of it is just finding out what it is. And then you're either faced with the disappointment of I had it already, or the happiness of it's super rare. I finally got it. And we're chasing that experience almost more than the actual thing sometimes.
Like a slot machine.
Yeah, well, so that's it. Exactly. Yeah. Like it's gambling essentially. Like you're, and that actually is something that we got into in the Cabbage Patch documentary, and we actually get into when we think about stuff like Pokemon cards and then blind boxes. Thankfully, kids' meals have not gotten to the extent where there's people rioting for them. I think that generally the kids' meal toys tend to be fairly common across the board. You can find some rare ones historically, but fairly common. But those blind boxes and those Pokemon cards, and then back in the 80s, the Cabbage Patch Kids, the idea was if you got one, essentially it's less about the object and it's more about you spent, let's say, $30 and it's worth $800 in the parking lot because nobody else could get one. So cha-ching, And I think that drives a lot of the adult demand for stuff like that. Beanie Babies, same thing, right?
Yes.
Remember those?
Oh yeah.
And that then occupies a segment of the buying public for these toys. And some would say that kind of corrupts it because you're like, this should just be for kids, Kids should kind of just be having fun with this, and we shouldn't be worried about, stuff like the value. And then you have others who I think would say, hey, I need the money, and this is an easy way to get it. You probably have better odds of getting a high valued Pokemon card than you do of winning the lottery, I would imagine, right?
Yeah.
So why not? Why not buy a few packs? See what's in there. Put something on eBay.
I'm listening to you talk, and while you're talking, I'm thinking in my head, oh shit, are we turning our children into like little gamblers and addicts?
Well,
I'm thinking I'm thinking about my own childhood, and the first thing that popped into my head, maybe because you said Cabbage Patch Kids, I was thinking about the garbage pail.
Oh, sure.
Those cards.
The cards.
And I remember being consumed with wanting to get a certain person.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Series
who.
1 Atom Bomb. That's a valuable card.
And I remember just being like I kept asking my mom to get me more and more and more of those cards.
Sure.
And this the fascination of opening the package because I wanted to get that one, whatever it was.
Sure.
Card and never getting it and just wanting more and more and more and more just so that I could have that dopamine release of being like, oh, I got it.
Yeah.
I got it.
Well, luckily, we're not doing that. Capitalism is doing that. But, nevertheless, we're involved in it.
Capitalism is doing it. As parents, we're, involving ourselves in it.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
Heather, you could probably think about this. How many things have we bought our kids over the years? And my kids are grown now; they're in their 20s, so I'm not still making them little gamblers. But
they're
definitely, they're big gamblers now. But definitely,
legally.
when they were little, I just fed into it because it made them happy.
The Shopkins thing, my daughter was very into, but then it became more about me, like needing to finish the series. Like we had one missing, and like I'd be in Facebook groups and like driving all over town, like trading and buying these things so we could have a complete set. My daughter didn't necessarily care about about having the complete set. Like that was my kind of OCD-ness of needing to have the whole thing.
Projecting your OCD on her. Awesome.
She didn't care. I kept it in. It was mine alone. But we needed to finish that set.
There's a sense of accomplishment in that, isn't there? You know, sort of whether it's rare or not, you did that.
Yes.
You know, there's a joy in it. I agree with that feeling for sure. I certainly acknowledge that exists, and that's a driving force. Otherwise, these packages wouldn't say things like "collect them all" or something like that.
The marketers know.
Marketers know,
right? So the toy industry is capitalizing on the fact that they know that our brains are.
Did you know
easily little addicts?
Did you know, for example, when Beanie Babies came out at the height of the Beanie Baby, eBay was also just sort of coming onto the scene. So we're talking about like mid to late 90s, right? Yeah. Beanie Babies occupied 10% of all products sold on eBay at that time. We're talking circa 98.
That's a lot.
Wow.
10%. So 10% of a big number is a big number.
Yeah.
And that is a lot. That is a lot. And that just shows you kind of how many people were sort of taken by this, adults that were taken by this idea of, let me cash in, let me collect, let me get involved. So these things then become more than just what kids are playing. But as we'll talk about later, the word just is kind of misplaced there because they're meaningful for kids to play with them. There's not just a toy. It's an important toy for a child to have and interact with. So
tell us more about that.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I believe is that toys are vessels. They are vessels for the intangible connections of humanity. So things like empathy, friendship, love, that sort of thing. When you are a child and you sit down with another child and you engage in play over a toy, that toy in that play starts to embody a connection very quickly between the two or however many people are playing. So I think in that way, we can't really say that, oh, these are just sort of these disposable playthings, throw them out, whatever. They actually hold some really important, I think, moments for people. And I think one of the ways we can see that is through nostalgia now, which is huge. The number of people looking at these toy objects, some of which are in front of me right now. If you can see them, great. If you can't, there's Transformers and Aliens and Batgirl and all sorts of things.
The Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
That's the only one I know on this entire table.
Alien.
Okay. Yeah.
Now,
from the movie Aliens.
Yeah,
there's going to be a quiz later, so definitely. But the people look at them and they say, "Oh, I remember that." Well, why is that an important statement? I remember that. What you're really remembering is the connection, the surrounding stuff that you were going through at the time, the person that you were, the thing that's kind of within the toy. You know, I always feel really a hollow experience when I buy something now that's like one of those it's back toys, like, those toys that existed, let's say in the 80s or 90s that we grew up with. And then a toy company comes along and says, it's back, you can buy it again. And sometimes that'll hook me and I'll go and I'll buy it again. And I'll say to myself, why do I not feel the way that I felt then? Because it's supposedly back. So shouldn't it be back? But no, the idea is that what was contained in it then is not contained in it now. I'm no longer the first grader sitting at the playground with my new best friend playing with a Star Wars action figure that we just got. And we're forming that bond and we're forming that connection. I'm now a different person. That person is back in the 90s, the kid. And in some ways, that will never be back. And I think, if we're going to talk about the sort of capitalism or economics of toys, this side of it is I think, not economic. I think this side of it is very emotional. The way in which we humans cannot really be sold ourselves again. We have to sort of evolve. We have to confront the fact that the artifacts of our past, they held what they held, and they can still be admired and loved today in new ways or old ways, but they're not gonna be that moment because that vessel has done its job. It has formed its connection.
You've evolved.
And you've
that
evolved.
moment is
so
past.
it no longer serves that purpose for you.
Exactly. And I think one of the great ways to appreciate toys as an adult is to say, well, this kind of brought me into my now. Like this loved me into my now or helped me feel loved into my now because I used it to form a connection with someone that mattered to me early in my life. Maybe they're still in my life. And we understand that was foundational. And that can be very meaningful. But I think if we're chasing a self that existed in the 90s, that we may be missing out on who we are here and now, which I think is important, and who we could be in the future. So
can you talk a little bit more to how they help you form connections?
Sure.
So if you talk about, now I don't need it anymore, but back then I did. What did that toy do for you in the then?
Yeah. So before I talk about my personal experience with that, I'd like to get into the work of Vivian, Gus, and Paley, who we were talking about a little bit before this.
Sure.
And if you don't know Vivian, Gus, and Paley's work, she's really instrumental. She wrote a book called The Boy Who Would Be a Helicopter. She's a kindergarten teacher in the early 90s, and she realized that she had a student who was kind of off by himself and generally rejected playing with anyone else or even interacting with anyone else. And through the class, she realized that she had another student who would like to build these kinds of towers out of boxes and things, that were around, like these little, 3-foot tall towers, and pretend that a doll was stuck in them. And she was really like playing with the thing. And a lot of kids were doing that too. So she kind of had the idea, Paley, that maybe the play story of the doll could start to involve a helicopter. Maybe a helicopter needs to rush in and save the day. Well, who was playing with the helicopter? That was this little kid who was off to the side just by himself. So she says, hey, I think,
can we bring these two together?
Yeah, exactly. I think that doll needs to be rescued by a helicopter. Does anyone have a helicopter? Well, kid's been playing with the helicopter, says, I do, runs over and saves the day. And from that moment, Paley noticed that the toy became the instrument that brought this young kid sort of out of his shell. And that happened more and more. So the way in which the toy mattered in that scenario was significant. Without the toy, there's not much to bring this child out of the corner, And I think that is very close to my own experience. I know that I, at that time, if we're thinking about kindergarten, was very, very shy. And I think that toys were the first things that I really felt like I knew and I could sort of live through, and were kind of avatars for a self that didn't exist yet, They were things that could interact with others, not other people necessarily, but if I took two toys and was playing with them together, I could make a little conversation, and I could practice what a conversation is like. That may sound ridiculous as an adult, but maybe not. But as a child, that was crucial, because that was something that I did not feel comfortable going up to another human being and say, hey, let's talk. I couldn't do that as a kid.
No.
So,
but to have those two toys and to be able to do it and kind of practice that and become more comfortable with that would allow you moving forward to be able to start doing that.
Exactly.
Can you say what you just said about the avatar? Can you say that statement again?
Sure. I think toys are an avatar for a self that does not exist yet.
I love that so much.
Thank you.
That's, I think, such a perfect, remarkable way to describe it.
Thank you.
And if it's okay with you, I'm going to use that when I talk to parents and when I train my staff in play therapy, right? So to hijack what you were saying just for a brief moment, as a therapist and as a therapist who works with children and as a group therapy practice owner who serves thousands of children over the years, we do a lot of play therapy.
Great.
A lot.
Great.
And one of the, biggest hurdles we face in play therapy is the parent that does not have the understanding of the value of using the toy, just like you said, as the vehicle with which the child can communicate and express what is going on inside of them, right? I always try to explain to parents that play is your child's language. Right. And so when they pick up the toy, whether it be a dollhouse, a puppet, even playing a game of Uno, they are expressing to us in the way that they know how to express the complexities that are going on inside of them. They are expressing feelings. They are asking questions. They are writing their stories. They are completing the empty spaces of their trauma stories that need to be filled in. They are making sense of the world.
Right.
And they are forming a bond and a connection with us as a therapist. Right. And a lot of parents don't really understand. And they feel like, I'm paying all this money and bringing my child in for therapy.
They want them to talk about why you're not getting along with your sister, talk about the trauma, talk about grandma dying, and not recognizing that they are just through other objects.
Yeah, exactly.
It's such an amazing way that they express, learn, and bond.
Yes.
Form rapport. Yeah. And we explain this to parents a lot. And some parents are wonderful and they get it. And they're like, you're the professional, you do you. And a lot of parents are just like, no. Teach the tools, teach the skills. I want my child to come home with tools and skills.
And the language.
And the language. And they're just playing Uno. And it's a game of Uno is never just a game of Uno.
Exactly. Yeah. I go through that too not with parents, but since I teach at Queensborough Community College, I'm also at Sarah Lawrence, and I use toys in both of my classes there. And the folks at Queensborough, they're folks who are just coming into college English literature learning. They're sort of early freshmen. And a lot of folks are kind of like, I don't really know if this is right for me. I don't know if this is a good place for me. And what I do is I start pretty early in the semester with a lesson on Lego. We end up reading a little bit of Lego's history, but we start by playing with Legos. And there is so much I learn about my adult students just by observing them play with Legos and helping them and everything. I can see who feels a little more frustrated by the obstacles in front of them. I could see who ignores the instructions and makes a submarine when their set is a seal or whatever the case may be. I can see all these different reactions that are really informative, and I can learn a lot. I can see students' creativity. I can see students' engineering abilities. I can see all sorts of things by observing that. And very seldom, but it does happen, I'll have someone go, why don't we just do that? Like, why did we do, like, this isn't kindergarten, right? Why are we playing with toys in college? Yep. Yeah. And I say to them, well, let's reflect on this. Like, let's actually reflect on how you felt. What did you do? And oftentimes they'll describe a process, which I think is very common when you're playing with Legos, of, I started to build a thing and I got frustrated and I took off this piece to see if that piece would fit better. And it did. And that encouraged me to keep going. And I ended up with this model, and I actually just think it's kind of cute. And I'm like, okay, well, so what can you do when you're, let's say, writing an essay? Oh, well, I write a paragraph and sometimes I put a sentence on and it doesn't feel right. So I take it off and I put another sentence on and it feels right. And then when I'm done, eventually I feel like I have a full essay that I'm proud of.
And that's that same process.
So it's the writing process. Okay, interesting. Maybe that's why you did it in an English class. Or maybe there's more meaning to it beneath that. You sort of have these experiences in life where, it's not really up to someone else to come in and tell you what it means for you. You reflect on it and tell me, and let's work on those kinds of skills of metacognition. And I think that can be really valuable for adult students,
And I'm just thinking it's interesting, Legos, because it's one of the fewer kind of really gender neutral toys. I mean, toys are so kind of skewed as, kind of masculine or feminine. Yeah. And, Legos are kind of a gender neutral, for lack of saying.
Well, it depends on the Lego.
Well, that is true.
They've got those, the pink boxes that have, the little,
flowers and
build a house. And
to their credit, they're trying to push back a little bit on that. The Lego Friends sets for a while took that identity as the girl Legos, right?
Yeah.
And now Lego has kind of been like, look, we're really trying to get past that, because the early days of Lego, as you say, were not that way. They were very like, anybody can play with these Legos. And they are, I think, as a company, trying to make that more and more their identity again. But I agree. They are basically gender neutral toys. And I do think that's really important. That's not something we see often enough. One of the things that I hear in Target or Walmart or whatever big box store often enough from parents, who I just sort of overhear in the aisles are them going to their child like, that's a girl's toy. You can't play with that. Or that's a boy's toy. You can't play with that. You have to go over there.
Yep.
And I'm thinking to myself, what would happen if your child did play with that? Like, would anything bad happen? I don't think so. Like if your child, who I guess is a boy, presents as a boy, plays with a Barbie, what's going to happen? I don't think
nothing will happen to the child.
Right.
It's the
It's
parent
the parent
who's having a problem with it, right?
Exactly.
It's actually harming the child, in my opinion.
Yeah, me too.
Right, denying them.
Yeah.
Right, because like you said, to your point, right, the toy is the vessel.
Yeah.
Right? It's the avatar for the self that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
And you're not allowing them to choose their avatar.
Yeah.
You're telling them, no, that avatar is not for you.
They can only choose from this aisle and these toys.
You need the pink toy. You need the blue toy. You're telling them who they are. You're forming and shaping their identity.
Yes.
For them, which may not necessarily work.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think, one of the cultural reference points we can use for situations like that is an understanding that toys as leisure is also a fairly new idea in the US. So for a while, toys were really teaching tools. Like if you were a boy, okay, here's your ball, go play with it, go be active. Here's your little kitchen set. If you're a girl, go learn how to use the pots and pans, right? So these are very stereotypical, very, sort of traditional Western gender norms. In the 1900s, once we get sort of the common use of plastics, plush, these kinds of things, really mass production after the Industrial Revolution, there's this excess of toys at that point where people are starting to say, well, maybe we can license this. Maybe we can make this action figure eventually. Maybe we can do these different options. So there isn't really like a teaching purpose so much as a leisure purpose to these toys. Now, of course, the avatar thing still stands, but the sort of manufacture purpose of them is, you're not necessarily buying your child a G.I. Joe because you want them to enlist in the military. You're buying them that because it has a talking box in it when it's fun to hear them do that, or it's fun to get all the little pieces or whatever it is, whatever the play pattern is. And that idea is relatively new. So I think adults have at times tried to look for that sort of, well, there's still got to be like this teaching purpose. And I think we've landed sometimes in toxic places with that, which is that, oh, well, this is teaching you how to be a boy. It's teaching you how to be a girl. And you can't be a boy and take a girl lesson. I don't want that, right? And I would say that's transphobic in my opinion, and in addition, right? And I do think it's crucial that kids are able to explore on their own and understand that as long as the toy is safe, just physically, bodily, it's not going to cause them any harm. There's nothing toxic about it. Then try it out. And kids will know right away if it feels right or if it doesn't. And, if it doesn't, you'll see it under the bed in one of those big boxes you're referring to, and you'll sell at a yard sale.
Not played with,
and that's the worst that'll happen, But you're right. It is about the adults and kind of just getting them on board with that, that mindset and that understanding of this is not there to harm your child. And obviously if you see any chokeable pieces or anything, that's a different story.
Yeah, that's not what we're talking about.
We're
talking about the dad who won't let their son pick
Have
out a
kitchen.
doll.
Exactly.
Right? Because then he's going to be gay.
Right.
Right? Because that's what happens.
Oh, no. Yeah.
I was going with doll, the kitchen.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, no.
Right.
My son had a, believe it or not, one of those little McDonald's drive-through things. It was like a kitchen, but it wasn't a kitchen. It was a McDonald's instead.
Oh, I remember them. Yeah.
And it had a little window thing.
Yeah.
So we had that because that's what he wanted.
Yeah.
I remember my daughter had a kitchen, but they also had the Home Depot tool set. And as someone who has power tools and has a whole workbench in the garage, I really kind of wanted to get her the workbench.
Yeah.
Really, it was a matter of space. Otherwise, I would have.
Yeah. Well, and this is actually something that I talk about in the book about kids' meal toys, because for a while, McDonald's would have the girl toy and boy toy. Sometimes they do the Barbie and Hot Wheels, right?
Yes.
And I remember, as a kid, I got the Barbie once, and mainly because I think McDonald's employee who's being paid minimum wage is not paid enough to gender your kid. Like that's just not enough. They're like grabbing stuff and here it is. My mom freaked out. Oh no, can't you see? You get the other toy, blah, blah, blah. All of this sort of panic that we're talking about. And it stuck with me because I was kind of like, well, first of all, and this is personal opinion, but the Barbie is way cooler than the Hot Wheels. I mean, come on, you've got the combable hair, it's posable. It does a lot more than a car. Now, this is going to make Hot Wheels people upset, but that's okay.
You're allowed to have your opinion.
Exactly. But the deeper thing is, well, why did this encourage such a panic in that moment?
Yeah. Good question.
Yeah. So I reflect a lot on that, and I'm someone who has gone through their own sort of gender journey over the course of their life. And the term that sort of lands best for me now is non-binary, but it's sort of been a whole life of reading memoirs and playing with toys and going into the pink section and going into the blue section and feeling how things feel and basically doing all that work later in life that I wasn't allowed to do as a kid. Because as a kid, it was pretty rigid in terms of the gender binary for me. So I had to do a lot of that later. And I still remember the first time I set foot in the Barbie section at the old Toys R Us that used to be in Times Square. And it was a big Barbie section. They have a big Barbie dream house in it. I was like sweating. I was in my mind, I was thinking, oh, I'm just here to buy something for my cousin. It's fine. Well, if anybody asks, that's what I'll say. And,
you felt like you weren't allowed to be there.
Exactly.
Which is, that's what's toxic.
Yeah.
It's not the fact that you wanted it.
Right.
Or what would happen to you if you bought it.
Right.
It's the fact that you felt shamed by the desire or the draw to be there. You were not given the opportunity to choose your avatar.
That's right. That's right.
What reflects who I am and what I want and what my interests are, and maybe having the opportunity and giving your children the opportunity to choose the toy that reflects who they are so that they can find their identity. And I'm not talking just about gender identity. I'm talking about just identity in general.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
Just let them find don't dictate to them what their identity is in general.
Yeah.
Right? This doesn't even just have to be about gender. Just let them find themselves without allowing yourself to project your fears and your anxieties and what other people are going to think if they come to your house and see that your son has a kitchen.
Yeah.
Or that your daughter has a tool set.
Because the other side to that is it won't work. Like if you are dictating what you want your kid to be through the toys that you are allowing them to play with, it just won't work. Like if it worked, I should not be here having the perspective that I have, because I was bought Tonka trucks. I was bought G.I. Joes. I was bought, basically every stereotypical boy toy you can think of, that was bought for me. And every stereotypical girl toy you can think of was kept far, far away from me. And I'm an only child, so I never had any interactions, with any siblings or anything like that. If that worked, I should be the most macho man you have ever
driving a pickup,
whatever. And I'm not. And so what that sort of says is we have our own thoughts. We are our own people, and those come out at some point. And honestly, if you're in that position where you're kind of suppressing them, it's just going to lead to a lot of, I think, personal unhappiness, and
that's the damage.
That's the damage.
You're damaging your
You're
child's
starting to
self-esteem.
feel shame and feel guilt and try to, hide that person that wants to play with the Barbie or is just interested in learning about the Barbie.
Yeah,
it's
curious.
not. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, you know what? My son, he loved watching High School Musical with my daughter. It was her favorite movie. And they were really close and they played a lot when they were little. Yeah. And he watched it with her. And then she wanted all the High School Musical toys. And then he wanted them too so he could play with her. And the two of them would sit and play for hours, these scenarios, and would play out these scenarios. And then he had some of his own High School Musical toys, like the dolls. I bought him dolls. Yeah. He had Troy Bolton and he had whoever else. Yeah. And he had a bunch of dolls and she had a bunch of dolls and they played together. And he's a guy. He's a guy's guy. He's, identifies as male and has a girlfriend.
Great.
And if he wasn't, that would be okay too.
Yeah, that's exactly.
But the reality is though at that time, it gave him the opportunity to play out scenarios that he needed to play out.
Yeah.
And he was able to communicate and connect with his sister.
Yeah.
And they were able to connect with each other through play.
Yeah.
It wasn't about gender. It wasn't about,
exactly.
sexuality.
Of course.
It was just about communication and expressing yourself, through an object.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think about this a lot in the context of today's toys, because I know now and I think if you walk down a toy aisle at a Target, you'll see this. So many of the boys' marketed toys feel like they are being marketed to folks that are my age. Very few of them feel like they're marketed to kids specifically today. So what I mean is, if I walk down the Target aisle, I'll see G.I. Joe Classified series, which is basically bigger versions of the same toys that I got in the 80s.
Uh-huh.
Transformers that are newer versions of the older toys from the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I'll see He-Man, which of course He-Man is He-Man. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'm not saying none of that would have an appeal to a kid today, but like that's stuff that I feel like is targeted a lot towards the adult collector, which is
the parent too that's buying for their kid.
Exactly. And
I remember that. Sometimes that nostalgia. Yep. Like I remember buying my daughter the whole strawberry shortcake set.
Yeah.
Because I had it as a kid.
Yep.
And I remember being so excited to be like, I loved this.
Sure.
So I'm going to buy it from my daughter. And
sure.
I made her like it.
That's awesome.
Because I liked it.
Yeah. And it's
Poor
cool
Lara.
to share in that way. I just think that when I go over to the, I guess, pink aisle, whatever you want to refer to it as, I see Monster High. And one of the things that I see around Monster High is adults, I feel like by and large, don't necessarily know what to do with it, because it has massive like intergender appeal and it kind of appeals to everyone. I was talking to my students about that the other day, Monster High specifically. And I was like, look, if Monster High was around when I was a kid, I'd be all over it. And one of my students, who's a guy, was like, I love Monster High. Like Monster High is amazing, And so it says to me that like there's a lot of this sort of innovation that's happening in this kind of 12-inch doll space that is making those kind of new or newer. And I feel like on the action figure side of things, there's a lot of that nostalgia driven kind of, we're selling it to the people who have disposable income now kind of thing, as opposed to kids. And I wonder if that is going to push more people of just all identities over into something like that kind of Monster High world, where you're kind of like, yeah, like anybody can kind of play with this. This is just kind of fun, and it's new and it's interesting, and it's not really tied to some 40-year-old property. It's just kind of interesting. So I wonder about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember my daughter was a Monster High character for Halloween
Cool.
one year.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So what else? I know you have a
Yeah.
bunch of toys on the table
I do.
here. So I'm wondering if there's something, for those of you that are listening and not watching,
Yeah.
we have all sorts of things. Can you maybe talk
I can't
to us?
identify any of them.
What's wrong with you?
I mean, the Stay Puft Marshmallow guy.
What about this?
Yeah. That is, any Star Wars fan will know, I think.
Yeah, no.
A-Wing Starfighter.
Yeah, no.
From Star Wars. Yeah, I mean, so basically... Alien.
I do know the Transformer.
Which Transformer is that, would be the question. That one is interesting because he does not transform.
Yeah, I got nothing.
I mean...
It's Soundwave.
And that's a dinosaur.
Correct.
It's from Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
The guy with the small arms who's always in the memes who can't clap.
Yes.
Tyrannosaurus
Exactly.
Rex.
Yep.
All right, so tell us about what you've got on the table.
Yeah, I
here.
mean, so basically what I did today is I picked up a box of my loose toys, which I have many, many of, and I brought that here, sort of not fully knowing what was in there. I started pulling out things that were appealing to me. So, in front of me right now, there's everything from a relatively modern Batgirl figure, which I love dearly, to actually one of my favorite Burger King toys from their kids meals, which is the Universal Monster kids meal, which came with this Dracula figure that actually fits inside his own coffin, and you can kind of rotate him up and down in there, which is kind of fun. It does have a lid somewhere, but the figure is detachable from the coffin itself, and it's just a lot of fun.
Because you'd be able to leave your coffin and then return to it.
Yeah, if you're Dracula, you need
does.
to.
Yeah.
You really need to. Yeah, exactly. It's important. And that figure actually is kind of interesting to me because it is reminiscent of the Universal Monsters figures that came out in the 80s under the Remco brand. So when I see that figure, that came out in the 90s in a kids meal, and it's like echoing a mold and a style that came out a decade before it, which I just think is interesting. I always think it's interesting how toys influence other toys. So like one toy will come out, it hits it big, and then other companies start to go like, oh, how can we sort of replicate that? And it basically changes the trajectory of their style. Like I think when you look at, there's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles figure in front of me, Usagi Yojimbo, who's a space rabbit in this case.
Space rabbit.
Yeah, exactly, because he's in his little spacesuit there. That figure is kind of a squat, kind of bulky figure. And when you think about that in a silo, you might be wondering, well, why does it look like that? But then if you think about it in the context of, oh, He-Man came out a few years before that, and that made it big. And those were all kind of these squat, kind of muscular figures.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't another toy company want to make something that feels sort of in line
replicates
with
that? And yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's working, so you go for it, right?
So you go for it. Exactly.
So you need a muscular rabbit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it creates an interesting space because at that point, you wonder where innovation kind of really is. And I do think obviously there's something unique about all of these toy lines, but you also see the influences kind of passing down and from one toy company to another. In my opinion, I think the most important toy company of all time is Ideal, which is not around anymore. But Ideal basically invented the teddy bear. They some would say, I would say, invented the action figure, even though Hasbro is the one who's credited with the term, because in the late 30s, early 40s, they came out with a Superman action figure for all intents and purposes, first of its kind. They essentially were the first to kind of license stuff and make that. Ideal is hugely important, and they're a New York-based toy company. Actually, they were out here in Queens. So I think that when you think about the history of toys now, it may feel like there's so much to think about. There's Transformers, there's G.I. Joe, there's Barbie, there's blah blah blah. There's Monster High, as we were talking about earlier. But when you go back a ways, a century, you see that the field was basically empty. So someone had to start just plugging stuff in and seeing what they could do with this new technology. Ideal was revolutionary in terms of their injection molding machines. Now we're going to get into the real technical weeds of this. Action figures, toys, plastic toys are made through injection molding, and that takes a lot of energy and a lot of heavy machinery to do. And Ideal actually built a plant in New Jersey that was ahead of its time in terms of injection molding. So they could crank out lots and lots and lots of toys. That stuff changes the game, and it makes the landscape that we kind of know today in terms of toys. So the important thing, I guess, in this conversation is that this all had to be built. We kind of arrive and we're like, oh, there's toys. There's always been toys. Yeah, sure. But what we have today, this specific landscape, was made by companies, and it was companies sort of meshing with the technology of its time to create what we have today. Go back, pre-1900, and it's a very different story. You still have toys, of course, but it's a very different story pre sort of this mass production era.
Do you have any thoughts on what you think is better?
Oh, in terms of like pre-mass produced toys or post?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. The literary theorist Walter Benjamin was a toy collector, and he collected specifically pre-industrial Soviet toys. That was his thing. He had a huge collection of those. So basically like the toys that someone would make on a farm because they were stitching together old corn husks or something, and they made something out of that. And I think that that is artistically really interesting and exciting to me. Growing up in East Tennessee, I would go into the Smoky Mountains where they would have craft fairs. So you'd get handmade toys there, things that local people had kind of made. And
like the whittled kind of like figures and heads and stuff.
Precisely. And actually that's the environment that Cabbage Patch Kids started in. because Martha Nelson Thomas started them in a Kentucky craft fair, basically like that. I think that those toys are incredibly interesting. They're, in many cases one of a kind because you've got somebody making each one. But at the end of the day, I grew up in an era of licensing and an era of mass production, and it is hard for me to separate the sort of identity work that I did, as we were talking about before, and the play that I engaged with as a child from those objects.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as what's better, well, if we're talking about like environmental impact, then certainly pre-industrial, is going to take the cake. Just ask the Yellow River in China, which is full of plastic. If we're talking about just, personally, what has really stirred in me the sort of creativity and things that I love now, I mean, yes, it's the mass-produced toys, of course, the licensed stuff that I had, a lot of what's in front of us right now. But that's also a kind of a contradiction that I have to think through and I have to kind of live with is I acknowledge the deep personal meaning here, but I don't want to be the type of person who gets to the place where they're like, this is perfect. They've never caused problems. Environmentally, they're great. And I'm sure all the workers who made them overseas are paid well.
Well, nothing's perfect. And
exactly.
That's okay.
It is okay.
I'm just wondering, socially, how you feel in terms of having all this variety versus just having the little thing that you can stitch together and having to let that be your vessel for everything, which may not necessarily work for building identity.
But I was just thinking that too. I mean, like I'm holding Batgirl and like Batgirl has a certain persona and you've got certain expectations of how Batgirl will behave versus having this generic wood whittled figure where it can be anyone. It can be a boy or a girl. It could be a mom or a dad. It could be, a president or an astronaut or, it's what, there's the imagination that goes along with what you put onto that wooden generic toy versus Batgirl in general is going to behave a certain way and you've got certain expectations of how she's going to, versus just almost like a blank slate of kind of, letting your imagination and kind of really project what onto that.
So in the toy world, there's a word for that. It's called directed play. Directed play is the way in which a toy company is directing you to play with a toy. So there actually, in my opinion, is no reason that figure you're holding of Batgirl could not be my Uncle Steve or whoever within the context of a play world. Now that goes against the directed play for sure, because the directed play is saying, oh,
Batgirl is Batgirl.
Yeah, exactly. This is a character with a context.
Strong,
and
she has a cape.
Exactly.
Yeah, she fights crime. She, so she's not home taking care of the kids and playing at the kitchen. Like,
sure. Exactly.
She could be if you really wanted her to.
I mean, right. And that's the thing. Like you get into this space of we understand what the directed play is. We understand what the intention is. We understand what the context of the character that's being represented there is. At the end of the day, one of the things creativity can kind of do is say, yes, I get all of that. And it's also a plastic figure that can kind of take on any meaning that I want it to. And it's accessible. Like I think the other thing to remember about sort of pre-industrial toys is that you wouldn't have had much time to play with them as a kid because you probably had a job. And the reason you don't have that anymore is, we've got unions that have made things a little bit more, stable, and you've got mass production and things like that. So, again, it's always hard for me to answer like, what's better, what's worse, because culturally it's such a mixed bag of things. But I do think that the accessibility of toys, I like the fact that, you can go into a dollar store and you can get a kid a action figure for $1. Like, and they're not terrible. Like they're really
they're
not.
pretty decent.
Some of them are,
I go there for a lot of our play therapy supplies.
Exactly.
And I was just going to ask you in terms of play therapy, I mean, do you find, do you have like very specific kind of action-y figures, or do you have the more generic ones that kind of allow the kid to kind of make them whoever they need them to be?
I think we have a little bit of everything. We have superheroes, we have Barbie dolls, we have puppets, we have doll houses. What I like to do with the doll houses is I buy like those, I forgot what they're called, the little animal families.
Oh, like
So
the
that
Sylvan families, those things? Or
they're like something
animals?
Critters or...
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Calico critters.
Calico critters.
Yes,
yeah,
those. So it's like the raccoon family and the bunny family and the whatever. So there's all different genders.
Sure.
And it's not specific to any sort of race. And it's just like, this is just a family of bunnies. And there's baby bunnies and teenager bunnies and mom bunnies and dad bunnies. And there's random bunnies that, can be whatever fits into your family. And so there's a lot of play that goes into that. And then there's just, there's a lot of play that goes into Play-Doh and creating your own stuff and creating things out of clay. Or it's amazing what kids will take a toy and pretend it's whatever. And so I let them guide. Yeah. And I'll say, I wonder what's happening now. And can you tell me more about this? I won't just assume if they're playing with a dinosaur that it's a dinosaur, because for them, it might not be a dinosaur.
Right, exactly.
For them, it could be a monster. It could be a superhero. And it looks to me like a scary dinosaur, but they're having it be whatever they need it to be to express their story.
And the trick is, as adults, to not lose that. Like, I think that is a great sort of idea for all ages. I actually did a writing assignment in my class where I gave each student an action figure, basically at random. And I asked them to just tell me the story of that toy. So they could write however they wanted to write. For example, with the Batgirl, if they wanted to write a Batgirl story, go ahead, do it. But if you didn't know who your character was, or you wanted to go a little differently, you could. I had one student, a young woman, who wrote a story. She got an action figure of The Rock, the wrestler, The Rock. And it was very clearly The Rock. Everybody knew it was The Rock. She knew it was The Rock. But she wrote this story about how what this was actually a female wrestler who had a certain name, who was stuck in the body of The Rock, and The Rock actually wasn't that good of a wrestler, but this woman was, and she always hated the fact that she was stuck in this body, and The Rock was getting all the credit for all her great wrestling and everything. And I loved it. Like, I was like, that is such a wonderful like story to me. I was like, and you took that figure and you acknowledged what it was, or what it's intended to be, and you said, you know what, I'm going to follow my creativity and go where it's telling me to go, and this is what she came up with. And I still remember it. This was years ago. I loved that story. So I think, like, as adults, it's important to kind of not lose that spirit, because you're right. We encourage it in kids, but I think if we encourage it in ourselves, that as adults, then all of a sudden the act of exploration and the act of creativity is not so scary. It doesn't have to mean you're X, Y, or Z. It just means that you're playing around and you're just using it as a way to figure things out. And I think that's actually joyful.
Yeah, it helps you grow and develop and create a sense of self and self-esteem. And you don't want to, if you're a parent and your child is playing, you want to encourage them to just play out and be exactly what they want to be. Right. So real quick, before we end,
sure,
I have a quick question for you.
Love it.
It might not be a quick answer, but we'll try.
I'll try.
So while we're talking, I'm thinking, so last week we did a podcast where we talked a little bit about, mom guilt, and we were talking about the role of women. And, at the end of our pod, I made Heather read a speech from the Barbie movie. Did you see the Barbie movie?
I did.
So you know the speech I'm talking about, probably.
I probably do.
America Ferrera talks about how if even a doll that represents a woman is getting such shit from society, right? And so, when you look at the history of Barbie, and you look at how, Barbie president, Barbie astronaut, Barbie this, Barbie that. And so my question to you, because this is not true just of Barbie, but of any toy, do you feel that toys have paved the way for certain groups or, marginalized groups? It doesn't have to be just women, but anybody, to make things, to help kind of move them forward in terms of rights or civil rights, or to make things more accessible or more acceptable or allowed for growth just through the development of the toy, right? For the little girl to have the Barbie doll who is carrying a briefcase, to be able to say, well, look, women can have a job. They don't have to just be a stay-at-home mommy. They can be the president, right? Maybe theoretically one day.
Absolutely.
But, so that's my question to you. Do you see that there's a trend at all, or has there been a trend in history where toys or toy manufacturers have definitely used their platform to create change or to try to create more rights or
Yes.
awareness.
Yes, you wanted a short answer.
Kind of
the answer is yes. But to dive deeply into why my yes can be so certain is because empirically, historically, we know this. Briefly, Willa Eason. Does that name ring a bell to anybody?
No.
Okay, Willa Eason, very important story. In the 1980s, she is a Black woman. She's still alive. Had a young son in the 1980s who was playing with He-Man action figures. And at the time, all of those He-Man characters that he was playing with were white.
Mm-hmm.
And she's hearing this and she's kind of like, geez, aren't there any like Black superheroes my kid could like play with that are kind of like that? So what she does is she creates a Black superhero called Sunman, and she starts up her own toy company called Olmec, which serves the purpose of specifically making Black representing action figures. So Sunman is one of those, but there's also action figures under the Olmec line of, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., like historical ones. There's dolls like Imani, which is essentially like a Barbie doll, but a Black girl.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole line of toys that exist specifically to represent Black people. And that comes out. Sunman is a huge hit by all like measures of purchasing. You know, it's getting sold out at places like Kmart, which at the time was, of course, quite huge, Walmart, you know, et cetera. And she certainly faced her share of racism from that. The toy world, the broader toy industry in the US, I think, was not prepared for that. But I think that what she accomplished was a company that said Black people have a place in toy boxes as well.
And should be represented.
And should be represented.
It's absolutely essential for every child to see a representation of themselves in a toy, because that, like you said, they're vessels, right? So if you're a girl and every toy is a boy, and if you're a Black child and every toy is white,
right?
What is the message you're receiving? Right. That Black people can't be superheroes.
Exactly. And interestingly, the sort of today portion of that story is now Mattel has brought back a bunch of their He-Man toys and everything. They also have brought back Sunman, and Sunman is in there. And Sunman they had to license from her because she had her own company, right? And remember, this is the 80s when she starts Olmec, because this is before Kickstarter. This is before like anybody can kind of come out and make a thing online and start something. Not to say it's easy now, it's not. But at the time, it's really hard. And she did that. And I think she's just one story of a person finding empowerment through making toys, through having toys, using toys. So the answer to your question is yes.
Good.
And we know it's yes.
That's the answer
through
I wanted.
people like Willa Eason. Yeah, exactly. And she's one of many.
Oh, so important.
Thank
you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, just, being that we have to wrap up, any last thoughts?
Play with your toys and open your toys and
what
go
about
to
those people that have to like keep them wrapped so they maintain their value?
Open them. Listen, I was just in Mexico City, and if you're ever in Mexico City, you got to swing by this place called Mujam. It's a museum of toys, and it's all loose toys. The owner of it says there's 5 million of them in this massive, massive warehouse complex. And they're all open. They're all artistically kind of posed, and it's a sensory experience. You go in there and you kind of feel it, and it's so playful, and there's so much richness there. And if you can just get to that sort of place where you're just having a lot of fun with these things, even if it is admiring them in the package, if that's what you find to be joyful to you, fine. But engage with them that way. And I think if you do, then you gain this sort of joyful, childlike perspective on the world that allows you to kind of see yourself and process yourself in ways that I think a lot of adults are unfortunately not lucky enough to do. But the answer is just very simple. Walk down the pink aisle, walk down the blue aisle, walk down the Lego aisle, you get some Pokemon cards, do it all and see how it feels. Even if you're an adult, it doesn't matter. Try it out.
Adults can play.
Adults can play.
And if you're a parent, let your children pick their toys.
Yeah.
Right? Not letting them pick is more damaging than letting them pick something that doesn't feel right to you. It's okay. And if they're in therapy, let them play.
Yeah.
Play therapy is so helpful. So I loved having you here.
Loved
I
being
learned
here.
so
Great.
much.
This was.
This was a great conversation.
Yes, it was. It
Yeah.
was. I want "Let Them Play" on a T-shirt. That's just a great slogan. Let them play. I like that.
I can do that.
Okay, great.
Yes, that's our crafty mom over there who likes to sit on Pinterest and learn and make things.
stuff.
Fantastic.
We'll have to send you one.
I love that.
Heather, any last thoughts?
No, this was great.
Yeah, it was.
It was.
So thank you so much for being here and teaching us all
Thank you.
these wonderful things that you have worked hard over the years to learn and research yourself.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the work you do as well.
Yeah, you're welcome. I love doing it. Heather too.
Yep.
Okay, so I guess it's time to wrap up.
Yes.
All right.
This
pod
went quick.
people. Yeah, it did go very quick.
Good.
Good conversations go fast,
Mhm.
right? I wish we had more time, but this is it. This is
Yep.
the end. Maybe we'll do this again.
Hope so.
All right, pod people. So thank you for listening or watching, whichever you're doing. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you are watching or listening so that you can be reminded of when new episodes come out so you can learn fabulous things and keep the podcast going. So I am Stacy.
And I'm Heather.
And we are
Why Do People Do That?
And we'll see you next time. Why Do People Do That is recorded and produced by Press Record Studios.